in, you can turn to Genesis chapter 10. We're in our 17th week of our study over Genesis, and I applaud you for showing up. Last week I mentioned that we were going to be getting into Genesis 10 this Sunday evening, and I said that at the end of the service last week, and I thought to myself, maybe I should not have said that, because if any of you took the time to look at Genesis 10, to look ahead, you would just see a long list of names. And you might be thinking, are we really going to just study a long list of names? And how am I going to stay awake during the reading of a long list of names? And how is he even going to pronounce any of those names correctly? And maybe that's what got you here. Maybe you just want to watch me try. And that's okay. But this list of names, it's setting us up for what's coming in the rest of the Bible. It actually has a very distinct purpose, and I want to draw that out and show you that purpose this evening. And we're going to get into a little bit of Genesis chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel. So we are going to get some action in addition to this list of names. And I'm not going to read the whole list of names to you. So maybe that comes as a relief to you. I know it comes as a relief to me because I don't want to humiliate myself trying to pronounce all of these names right. But what this list of names is teaching us is it's a list of names called the Table of Nations. If you were to read it, get into the commentaries and see what the scholars have to say about this list of names, it's entitled the Table of Nations, and it's showing us that God is sovereign over all of the nations of the earth. It's showing us that God is sovereign over the scattering of all the people over all of the earth. And spoiler alert, it's showing us that God is sovereign over the uniting of all of his peoples from all of these nations on the earth. And that's where we're going to get to by the end of this time together studying this passage. And so what I'm going to do today in Genesis chapter 10, we're going to take a mile-high view of what's going on in Genesis chapter 10. Again, so I don't humiliate myself trying to pronounce all of these names that are in there. And here's a way to think about this list of names. I remember back to my high school graduation, and my principal gave the same instruction that maybe your principal did when you graduated high school. Please hold all of your applause until the end so we can say everyone's name and they can walk across the stage. And why do we have that rule? Well, we have that rule so that we're all not there forever, right? Let's wait and then save our applause till the end. Let's let everybody get across the stage, and then we'll give everybody a big round of applause, and that way everybody can get out of there. Well, I remember when it came my turn to have my name called out as I was in line. They say my name, and in this quiet gymnasium full of people, I hear way in the back someone whistling and hollering, "Yeah!" and just as loud as he possibly can. And I know immediately, I recognize the voice. It's my Papaw Tony, who is just yelling and rooting for me in the back of the auditorium, not following the rules. My grandpa was an exceptionally loud man. And he came from a family of loud people, and he didn't care about the rules. So as I got my diploma from the principal, I said, "Sorry, that's my grandpa," and then walked the rest of the way off the stage. Well, if you could think of this list of names as a list of people maybe getting ready to graduate, and if you had a room full of every people group, every tribe, and every nation in the entire world watching this graduation ceremony, every name that gets called would give a people group an opportunity to cheer. Because every single people group would be represented in this list in Genesis 10. There would be a moment in which a people group would be able to stand up and say, "Yeah, that's my relative, that's my ancestor right there." And so when we get through this list of names, what we're being told is you can make connections from this list to literally like every people group mentioned in the Bible, throughout the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And if you were to deep dive on every one of these names, you can find a lot of really cool connections. Now, I've told you as I've gone through Genesis, we can't go down every rabbit trail or we'll be here for the next 10 years. So I've tried to pick a pace, and I'm just trying to stick with that pace. But if you were really wanting to slow down, this is a really cool chapter in the Bible to slow down, because you can attach a lot of these names to people groups around the world to this day, or countries, and why they're named that. They can trace that back to a name that's on this list. Now, there are some names on this list that we're not sure what they connect to, but it seems like about 2/3 of the names were really solid on what they connect to, and then the latter third, it's like, well, maybe this, maybe that. But there's a ton of information in Genesis chapter 10. But again, I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version of what you would find and what would jump out at you if you were going name by name. So let me just read the first verse of Genesis chapter 10 so that we can kind of get our bearings here. It says, "These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood." So we've been studying Noah and the flood here recently. We know that before the flood, mankind kind of fractured into two paths, the people who recognized God and the people who didn't. And we see God's judgment in the flood, and humanity is wiped out. And you have Noah and his 3 sons and their wives who are spared, and we are now getting to see the generations that then extend beyond from Noah and his 3 sons. And so chapter 10, it can be divided up into 3 sections. Section 1 is just verses 2 through 5. That's the descendants of Japheth. Then you look at verses 6 through 20. That's the descendants of Ham. You look at 21 through 32, the remaining portion of chapter 10, and that's the descendants of Shem. There's just 3 sections in this long chapter of names. So let's just look at that first little section, verses 2 through 5. These are the sons of Japheth. This is his line. And if you were to go one by one looking at all these names, there's one name that would immediately jump out at you if you knew your stuff, which I didn't. I had to read about it to know my stuff, right? And so the name Javan, that would immediately be one of those names that jumps out at you. And if Javan's name was called at that graduation ceremony, he would have a lot of relatives jumping up and cheering for him, because he is the guy he's the ancestor of all of the Greeks. If you did all of your homework on the Greek Empire, you could trace it back to Javan. And you think about what a big impact the Greek culture has had on humanity. The invention of, they got philosophy, you got democracy, the Olympic Games, all of those things. The Greeks are responsible for the language in which the New Testament would be taken around the entire globe. The gospel would be taken to the world. I think it's moments like this, and it's when we learn things about the names on this list, that God is telling us, hey, you know how the Greek language is what the New Testament was written in and was it took the gospel around the world. I was setting that up all the way in Genesis chapter 10. I was thinking about that and had that sovereignly planned out all the way back to Genesis chapter 10, when you can see Javan's name mentioned on my list as a descendant of Japheth. A few other names, if you've studied your Old Testament, you might recognize Magog, Meshech, Tubal. Those names would pop out if you've read Ezekiel, or especially if you've studied some of the end time prophecies in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. And then you can see those same names mentioned again when you get into the book of Revelation that quotes some of these passages out of Ezekiel. If you went again through that list of names, another name would jump out at you. Tarshish. That's like the hardest city name to say. Tarshish. That's their descendants would be like modern day Spain. They'd be jumping up and cheering right there. But we recognize that name. That's where Jonah tried to flee to whenever he was fleeing from God, who told him to go to Nineveh to preach to them, and then was swallowed up by the fish instead. Again, you can deep dive on every one of these names and find things like that. You would either find connections to other Old Testament stories or places in the New Testament. You can find, there's archaeological proof all over the place, obviously biblical proof for these connections. And this is the type of study that if we were to go, again, name by name, we could be here all night talking about these connections. Well, let's go to that second section, verses 6 through 20. That's Ham. You remember Ham, right? If you were here over the sermon we had about Ham, first of all, sorry. That's some information I don't ever care to preach again. But Ham, one of Noah's sons, he was the one that he did something very bad to Noah, and his son Canaan gets cursed. Well, when you look at the descendants of Ham, you're going to see some more names that maybe look familiar to you. And it's no wonder that the descendants of Ham there's a lot of names on his list that are troublemakers for the people of God. Well, that makes sense. They came from Ham, the troublemaker himself. One of the names that pops out at you is Egypt, depending on what translation you have. Actually, if you have the King James Version or the NASB, you see Mizraim, Mizraim. That's just the Hebrew word for Egypt, but it's the same thing. So we've heard of Egypt. This name on this list, Egypt, he's not named after the country Egypt, but it's the other way around, right? I mean, Egypt, to say that they were trouble for the people of God is an understatement, right? They ended up enslaving the people of God. Of course they did. They're descendants of Ham. Another name on that list, we know Canaan, who was cursed by Noah, and the circumstances, again, I don't want to repeat. and it's Canaan, his people are the Canaanites. And you know, the Canaanites in the Old Testament, that's like the main enemy of God when you get into books like Joshua and Judges, the Canaanite people. And so the Canaanites descended from that curse on Canaan. And, but it's not all bad when you look at the descendants of the Canaanites. There is one name in the list of descendants in the Old Testament that is a major positive. You get to Rahab. You might remember Rahab, who was a Canaanite woman and helped the people of God. And Rahab ends up being the great, I'd have to say great 30 times, grandmother of Jesus. And so you get to see some redemption even in the line of Canaan. And Rahab is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. If you keep going on that list related to Ham, you'll see Cush, which would end up being like Ethiopia. Again, you can find some redemption there too. You might think of the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in the book of Acts, who converts to Christianity in Acts chapter 8. But the people of Cush, they were known as enemies of the people of God, especially when you get to that name Nimrod. Nimrod, we're told, is a mighty hunter before the Lord. Okay, so when I was studying this list of names, I did go on this rabbit trail, and I'll have to share it with you. You ever wonder why the name Nimrod is an insult in our culture? You Nimrod. I got curious because I didn't know. I'm like, how and why is Nimrod an insult? Why can I call you a Nimrod? And we all know that is a negative thing when I call you that. Well, so I get on the internet, so I'm trying to research where this originated. And if you're a fan of the Looney Tunes and you grew up watching Looney Tunes, you're really going to like this. The insult came from an episode of Bugs Bunny. And so, Bugs Bunny in Looney Tunes, he's always being hunted by Elmer Fudd, right? You wascally wabbit or whatever. And he's trying to hunt him unsuccessfully. Well, because Nimrod is this mighty hunter in this list of names, Bugs Bunny, in a way of mocking Elmer Fudd, calls Elmer Fudd Nimrod, as to mock, oh, you're a mighty hunter. Way to go, Nimrod. And so if you were a Bible nerd back in the day watching the Looney Tunes, you immediately got the joke. But over the years, fewer and fewer Bible nerds, that just became an insult, and we didn't even know why, but that was the original joke. That's why you slam someone and call them a Nimrod. So you can bust that out with your hunting buddies next time if you want to mock them when they miss the target. Let's call him a Nimrod. But Nimrod, he's a big name back in the day, right? He goes on to found the city of Babel, which ends up being Babylon, which results in Nineveh and the Assyrians, if you trace all of that history. And all of these people, descendants of Ham, they hated God's people. A lot of trouble for God's people. And they're always rebelling against God. They're always mocking God. And so I think, again, God's showing us this list of names, and he's saying, I just want you to know that I'm sovereign over all of this activity. I'm sovereign over the scattering of these peoples. These oppressive kingdoms have all come and gone, but I am doing a work amongst them. Section number 3, verses 21 through 32, those are the descendants of Shem, that third son on the list that we know is the firstborn. Isn't that weird? Isn't it weird that Japheth, the youngest brother, is mentioned first, and then Ham, and then it gets to the oldest brother, which is Shem? Because in the Old Testament, if you know anything about the Old Testament and the culture amongst the Old Testament, you know that it's a big deal to be the firstborn. Like the firstborn, that's the one who gets the inheritance. That's a really big deal in Old Testament culture. And Shem is mentioned last, but I think this list of names, it's saving something special for us here. You notice in verse 21, it says Shem was the father of all of the children of Eber. Father of all of the children of Eber. That word Eber, what does it mean? Well, the root of the word Eber is Hebrew. It's as if this is saying in verse 21, Shem was the father of all of the children of the Hebrew people. This is the line of the promise. This is the chosen people of God that comes through that eldest son of Noah named Shem. It's through his line that we're going to get to guys like Abraham. It's through his line that we get to the nation of Israel. And of course, it's through his line that we ultimately get to Jesus. And when you look at the genealogy of Jesus mentioned in Luke chapter 3, I think it's verse 36, you see when it gets to the descendants of Jesus, it takes it all the way to Adam. But whenever it gets to the three sons of Noah, it just mentions one. It just mentions Shem, because that's the line of the promise. Jesus comes from the line of the promise, and Shem's descendants are that line. So let's just pause for a second. Again, I've just given you like kind of the Reader's Digest version of information from Genesis chapter 10. We zoom out, we look at this mile-high view of this chapter, and we see that how from this one family, all of the civilizations of the earth happen, all across the globe. But only one of them has the promise. Only one of those people groups end up being ultimately the people group of God as we read throughout the Old Testament. Why? What happened? Wouldn't you think that after the flood, it's just Noah's family? Isn't it all going to be just good people from there on out? Like, isn't it all fixed? No, we studied that a couple of weeks ago. The flood did not fix the sin problem. The flood helped us to know how God feels about sin. It taught us about the judgment of God upon sin, but it did not remedy the sin problem. And so, in addition to Noah and his three sons surviving the flood, we also learned that sin survives the flood. And we see that a lot of the descendants that go on from Noah end up sinning in horrible ways and even oppressing the people of God and rejecting who God is. And that's what sin does. Sin shatters relationships. It isolates us, and it scatters God's people in all sorts of directions and the rest of everybody else in all sorts of directions. That's what sin does. And this table of nations is teaching us that, hey, God is sovereign over all of that as well. So then we get into something really interesting here. At the end of this list of names, we get into Genesis chapter 11. And immediately we see this moment told to us that is the Tower of Babel. And it's a really well-known Old Testament moment. And this Tower of Babel moment that we're learning in these first 9 verses, it would take place in the midst of that list of names. It's kind of like we read this list of names and we get all these generations of people, and we get to chapter 11, and it backs up in the midst of all of those names, and it tells us about an event that took place. An event that took place in the midst of all this, when there was a lot of division amongst the people in the world. So let me read to you the first 4 verses. It says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" What's going on here? Well, we remember what God instructed to his people. We know what he said to Adam, and then we know what he said again to Noah when things are kind of rebooted or reset in a way. He tells them both, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." He told that to Adam, and then he told that to Noah after the flood. "I want you to be fruitful. I want you to multiply and scatter among the earth and bring glory to me." But we know sin survived the flood too, and that's not what these people want to do. Be fruitful and multiply and scatter among the earth and bring glory to you. How about we all stay right here and make a name for ourselves and make it about us? We're not gonna spread out and call upon your name. We're gonna stay right here, and we're gonna build a mud brick skyscraper to make a name for ourselves. We're gonna make something of who we are. And we're learning a lot about what's at the root of the sin problem here amongst people. Let's keep going in verses 5 through 9 and look at the response that God has to that. "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, 'Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." Now it's interesting God's response to that moment, right? You see what it says God said? Oh man, this is only the beginning of what they'll do, and nothing that they purpose to do will be impossible for them. We got to be careful how we read that. We can read a lot of emotion into that may not be there at all. I think if you read that in a way that makes God sound insecure, you may think God is worried. Oh no, they all speak the same language, and they'll be able to do anything. I better do something or they'll be unstoppable. Oh no. I would encourage you not to read it like that, because that would make no sense whatsoever. That the creator of the universe, who put the stars in the sky, who invented the sun, would be scared of the unity amongst a group of sinful people in a mud brick skyscraper. I mean, how big could this mud brick skyscraper even be? He could just take a little tornado and wipe it out, or flick it like a booger, No problem. So God's not worried that mankind is going to take over and rule in some way that he can't control. That's not at all what's happening here. God is lamenting the potential of human pride. He's lamenting the fact that these humans are so corrupt that they unify. In the broken state that they're in, they're all going to unify against me. They're not going to be for God, they're going to be against God. If they're unified in this way, they're going to make a name for themselves. They're not going to make a name for me. They're not going to exalt me. It's going to be all about self-exaltation. And so God, in an act of mercy, he divides mankind so it wouldn't end up like that. He confuses their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So it all sounded like Babel. Now, I would have loved to have witnessed that moment, right? I mean, how incredible must that have been, this miraculous moment in which suddenly everybody doesn't understand everybody, and you're looking around for people that do understand you, and you understand them. It's like, I imagine that. I don't know what movie that come from. Do you understand the words coming out of my mouth? Like, I just imagine, like, they're just raising their voice at each other, trying to understand each other. But just zoom out again. I'm taking that mile-high view because we're learning something about the story that is contained in Scripture. We're learning something about what God is doing in the grand scheme of things. The Bible is an incredible book for so many reasons. It's a collection of 66 books that's put together, and it's about the nations, tribes, and peoples and tongues of the earth and what God is doing amongst them. And we're learning about God's plan of redemption that exists amongst all of the tribes, nations, and peoples and tongues, from Genesis to Revelation. And God's like, you don't want to fill the earth and make much of me? Too bad. I want to scatter you all over the earth, and you are going to end up making much of me, because I'm God and you're not. And all the nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues will glorify me, period. Whether you want that to happen or not, that's what's about to happen. This is what God is showing us in this mile-high view. How does he do that? Well, we know that he's going to call his people from all of these nations, tribes, and tongues and peoples through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we get to see this really clearly when we get to a moment in the New Testament that is exactly the opposite moment of the Tower of Babel. You can draw a straight line from Genesis chapter 11 right to Acts chapter 2, which is where I would encourage you to turn to next. You could draw a straight line from this event that takes place at the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 and just draw it straight to Acts chapter 2 at the day of Pentecost. You ever watch a movie and you get all of these details in the movie and you don't really know how it all connects until you get to the very end, and then something happens in the movie and you're like, oh man, all of those details mattered big time in a way that I did not expect them to matter. Like, you originally, you just thought they were irrelevant facts, but when you get to the end, it's like, oh man, that had purpose to it. There was a point to that. Well, this is how the Bible works in a lot of ways. You get to Genesis chapter 10 and you see this list of names, and then you see this seemingly random event that takes place in Genesis chapter 11 in the Tower of Babel. But as you read through Scripture, especially when you get to all the way to the New Testament, to Acts chapter 2, you realize, whoa, these events that took place back in Genesis 11, they have so much significance. I mean, again, this is what's incredible about the Bible. 66 books written over the course of 1,500 years by 40 different authors, and it all ties together in this unified story from Genesis 11 to Acts chapter 2. In Genesis 11, we see that humanity is scattered miraculously because of God's judgment upon their pride and rebellion. But when you get to Acts chapter 2, at the day of Pentecost, you see that the confusion is undone. That miraculously all of these nations that are represented there are brought together through the preaching of the gospel, and there is comprehension there. Just a complete opposite circumstance in Acts chapter 2. Let me just read it to you. Acts chapter 2, I'm going to read 12 verses to you. That seems like a chunk, but since I didn't read that entire list of names in Genesis chapter 10, I think I've earned this. All right, so follow along with me in Acts chapter 2. Look what happens at the day of Pentecost. And look how it's the total opposite circumstance of the Tower of Babel. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does it mean?" What does it mean? You see how the complete opposite circumstance takes place, and it starts to bring great meaning to this moment at the Tower of Babel from the descendants of Noah. What's it mean? It means that all of these things that are happening, it's a part of something that's much, much bigger. It's a part of God's grand purpose amongst human history. His plan of redemption is unfolding before their eyes through the gospel of Jesus Christ. All along, Genesis 10 and 11 meant way more than we thought. When we see that division that takes place in the Tower of Babel, the division that took place there was more than just a linguistic division. It was that sin is what caused that division. Sin is what scattered people. The division was a spiritual problem. And then we have the uniting of all of those people groups at the day of Pentecost. And their unification was more than just a linguistic unification. The unification was the solution to a spiritual problem that they were hearing about the gospel of Jesus Christ. All of their sins had been atoned for. They had been reconciled back to God through their salvation in Jesus Christ. And so all of the confusion that took place at the Tower of Babel is now undone in the day of Pentecost. It's just incredible how the Bible weaves this story of the gospel through the books of Scripture. And when you get to the end of the Bible, we see even a more complete, a more full picture of just what God is doing amongst mankind. If you turn to the book of Revelation and turn to chapter 7, I'm just going to read a couple of verses out of that, but we get a snapshot of what is to come in Revelation 7. Revelation's an easy book to find, right at the very end. In Revelation 7, verses 9 through 10, this is from a chapter that says, "A great multitude from every nation" is the title of that paragraph. And the Apostle John, who wrote the book of Revelation, is sharing with us visions. And he's writing these visions down so that we can see how this story of the gospel is going to wrap up. And it says in chapter 7, verses 9 through 10, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" I think one amazing thing to think about when you read the book of Revelation and you read about these visions and you see moments, these pictures painted in our minds at the end of time or at the beginning of eternity, I think it's important to see that when you see this ocean of people that's from every tribe and nation and language, you're in that picture. Like if you believe in the gospel, you're in that vision. When John has that vision, like your face was a little speck in there. I think it's just an encouraging thing to think about. All of these people who had ever placed their faith in Jesus, they're there. All of the people of God are there. And it's kind of like when you read about this moment, this moment that is ahead of all of us who believe in the gospel. We get this snapshot of a moment that's kind of like a graduation, like we're all showing up to celebrate this graduation. What are we graduating from? Well, we're graduating from a fallen and broken and sinful world to perfection and eternity with God. I can't wait for that graduation. And you look at the story as it unfolds in these visions in the book of Revelation, our names are listed. They're written out in a book. You know, when you go to that graduation ceremony, you're handed the pamphlet with everybody's name on it. Well, all of the people of God, all of their names, before the foundation of the world, they were written down in the Lamb's Book of Life that is mentioned in multiple chapters over and over in the book of Revelation. That all of the people of God, their names are written in there. If you believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And you will be at that graduation. By God's grace, through faith, you will be there, and you will be graduating from a sinful and broken world into an existence of perfection with God for all of eternity. But the difference between that graduation and any graduation you may have participated in the past, it has nothing to do with your accomplishments. It has nothing to do with your efforts. Unlike any other graduation you've ever been a part of, you did not earn that graduation. Jesus earned that graduation for you. It's a graduation that you didn't earn, but you still get to attend. You don't have to pass any exam to be perfect. Jesus was perfect for you. You don't have to show a list of your good deeds in addition to make sure your name doesn't get blotted out or anything like that. No, Jesus atoned for all of your sins. So what does it mean? We get to zoom out and we see how Scripture works together and tells us this grand purpose of God and his story of redemption that saves us. What does it mean? Well, I think it's an opportunity for us to reflect upon that and ask ourselves, will I be there? Will you be there? In those visions that John shares with us in the book of Revelation, are you a little dot in that vision? If you believe that Jesus has done everything necessary to bring you into that kingdom, I can assure you that you will be there celebrating. And so that's what we're going to reflect upon to close our service, as we do every week. We're going to reflect upon the gospel of Jesus Christ that ensures we will be there at that celebration at the end of time, making much, not of ourselves, but making much of who God is, the mighty works of God, and what he has done throughout all of human history, from Genesis 10 to Acts 2 to right now. So let's meditate upon that in prayer as we close. Lord, every week I think about how grateful I am to have this group of believers to study your word with. Even to study moments in Scripture and chapters of the Bible that are just a list of names. Lord, everything in your word has a purpose. And sometimes as we learn these things from your word, it may not make complete sense to us in the moment, but we can trust your word that as we learn more and more about you through your word, that you will connect these dots by grace through your Spirit in our minds so that we can understand your grand purposes for all of mankind. Lord, thank you for allowing us to see that as we make this connection from the Tower of Babel to the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. I'm so grateful that you're sovereign over the events of mankind. I'm so grateful that you're not panicking and trying to solve this dilemma that has spiraled out of control. What a relief it is to know that you are sovereign and you rule over all of it. It all falls within your providence. And we can have hope and we can trust you that you're going to work things out according to your purpose. And we know that those purposes are for our good because your word tells us it's for our good. And so, Lord, help us to meditate on your works tonight. Help us to meditate upon what you did through sending your Son into creation to save us. As we take the bread and drink the cup, Lord, may we make much of you and not of ourselves.